All right. Looks like it's recording. Okay. Welcome, in Bears fans, to Bear Report podcast. We're here to recap the 2022 NFL Draft, an 11-man class for Ryan Poles and the Chicago Bears. They went into the draft with just 6 picks, made a couple trades on day 3, and acquired more draft capital and kind of calmed the, let's say, nerves of fans after what happened on day 2, which necessarily wasn't really a bad thing. We're going to kind of give some instant reaction here to exactly what happened and what's going to happen moving forward with rookie minicamp on deck for next weekend. And then also give some thoughts on just the state of the Bears after they essentially are finished with the draft. I'm Zach Pearson, and I'm going to bring in Usaid Koshal here to kind of break things down with me. Usaid, what's kind of your general thoughts right off the bat of how this Bears draft played out over the past 3 days here or so?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for having me on first off, but I just think the whole thing from start to finish was there were obviously some great picks like Kyla Gordon. There were obviously some very polarizing picks, but I think that, when you look at the draft class in general, I mean, I saw some crazy statistic floating out there on Twitter. This is the first time the Bears have had more than 10 or 11 picks, I think, since 2008. And that's going all the way back to the Jerry Angelo era. But the reason I bring that up is because I think that this is what Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus are aiming to do here. You look at the Colts and Chiefs, and those are two organizations where over the last couple of years at the NFL level, I mean, those two teams have basically become models for how to draft and develop homegrown talent. And I think that the Bears have honestly been one of the worst organizations in the NFL when it comes to drafting and developing homegrown talent. So this was kind of a new era of Bears football because we're going to be moving into uh, the next few years here with Poles and Eberflus. It's all going to be about that homegrown talent. And look, I mean, credit to Ryan Poles. He got creative with, I think the Bears had 5 draft day trades on day 3. They started off with, I think, 7 or 8 total picks, and Ryan Poles turned that into 11 picks by constantly trading down. Obviously, from a writer's perspective, it was kind of obnoxious, I should say, to see the Bears having to move constantly up and down the board. But you also look at, I mean, they got some great value with offensive line. I think a hidden gem, as a lot of national media people are terming it, at edge rusher. So I think it's an intriguing draft class. A lot of ready to go day one starters, but a lot of low risk, high reward guys too.
Yeah, and it pretty much started off with they had 6 picks scheduled, 3 on day 2, 3 on day 3, and they have a roster that has to be filled out with talent. They had a lot of holes on the roster, and they needed to find a way to fill that out, and they did so. And Ryan Poles got aggressive by making a couple trades on Saturday, and the first one he traded actually a future draft pick, giving the Chargers back their 2023 6th-rounder that they got, from the Khalil Mack trade, and then acquiring 2 7th-round picks. They were both comp picks late in the round. And then, when they were scheduled to pick at 148 and 150, they kind of moved back as well with both trades and acquired more draft capital. So looking at it, it's a lot of lottery tickets in a way on day 3. I mean, you're going to find some talent. You're going to be a guy, you're going to be in a situation where you hope that one of these 4 offensive linemen that you picked can stick, and they're going to come in and compete. And I think the Bears got some great value on guys. One thing we have to note here is this is a very deep draft class for the main reason that a lot of college players got an extra year in COVID. A lot of players use that extra year of eligibility to come back and play for an extra season and then head over into the draft. And that's why you saw, a lot of guys, the Bears, I don't think they picked a player under the age of 23 in this draft. A lot of guys overall are older. If you look, it's not just the Bears. You look at a lot of these picks. I mean, obviously, the stars that come out a little early, that's going to happen. But more than ever this year, there's a lot more older type players. For the Bears here, this is a deep draft where you can find some good players in the fourth, fifth rounds, potentially the sixth round. It's a lot harder in the sixth and seventh round, but finding talent in the fourth and fifth, probably shouldn't be a problem for the Bears. And I think they have some talented players with this draft class. It's an 11-man class. And then they also signed, I think they're somewhere up to 14, 15 ish undrafted free agents they signed, plus more tryout players they can add to their roster after this upcoming weekend. But kind of just to start, you look at this draft class, and the Bears, they went on day two, Kyla Gordon with their first pick in the second round, a defensive back out of Washington. They went safety, Jaquan Brisker out of Penn State with their second pick in the second round. And they finally went over to the offensive side of the ball and took Velus Jones Jr. out of Tennessee, an older player who has experience with USC and Tennessee. But the thing to note about him is he did get better as the years went on. And yeah, he's an older player, but he's very durable. He told us he only had a high ankle sprain, was the hardest injury he's had. So, we can complain that they didn't go after a wide receiver. That was probably a spot that maybe Poles, wanted to trade back at. But we can say, oh, why didn't he trade back? He should have traded back. They might not have gotten a call there to have a trade back. So starting with the day two picks, I think that the Bears found two starters in their secondary, and I understand the frustrations. You want playmakers for Justin Fields, you want offensive talent, and it just didn't happen. But last year, going back to last season, a lot of people, myself included, said this was one of the worst secondaries. They had holes in the secondary. They've had a hole in the secondary since Kyle Fuller left. They've had a hole in the slot as well. They have a hole at strong safety. They haven't been able to fill a hole at strong safety since Adrian Amos. They drafted two guys that are going to come in and very likely going to start week one. You have to address the secondary too. You could score 30, 40 points. I understand that given Justin Fields' help. You also have to defend too. You can't be giving up 40 points. So I really like the value with both of those picks. I'd be very curious to see if Christian Watson was there when the Bears made a pick, if they would have gone that route. Green Bay did jump ahead of them, and for whatever reason, I'm still trying to think of a good reason why the Minnesota Vikings not only traded with Green Bay, where everyone knew Green Bay was going to take a wide receiver, and everyone knew that Green Bay had a glaring need at wide receiver. They trade with Green Bay there, allow them to get a wide receiver. They also trade with Detroit and allow them to get a wide receiver. So, you know what? I hate doing this, but I hope karma gets back to the Vikings, and I hope, the Packers and Lions eventually throw all over that secondary. Yeah, the Vikings did address the secondary, but you helped two divisional teams. So I would have been curious to see if Christian Watson, if he was there, what the Bears would have done. But looking at this draft class with wide receivers, it's a deep class. It was a really deep class. I'm a little more disappointed they didn't go wide receiver later on day three, especially with some of the options there. I thought Khalil Shakir would have been a good option. The Bears actually traded the pick to Buffalo, and they took Khalil Shakir. We just kind of have to trust Ryan Poles. But as far as day two goes, I really like what they did with their secondary. And, Velus Jones, it's we just have to kind of wait and see. The Bears obviously have a plan for him. They're hoping he could be a weapon in their offense. So I understand the frustrations with it. I'm not going to sit here and say he's going to be a great pick or a great pro. I'm also not going to sit here and say he's going to be a terrible pro because we just don't know yet. We have to wait till he gets on the field and we can actually see him in action.
Yeah, and let's just break down some of those guys. Speaking of wide receivers, how about three of Justin Fields' former teammates, Garrett Wilson, Chris Olave, and Jamison Williams, who started at Ohio State but transferred to Alabama, going 10, 11, 12. I think really what set the stage here for why the Bears kind of approached the draft the way that they did is because Andrew Freeman and I, who co-host the Picks for Polls podcast with me, I remember you mentioning too that, hey, for the Bears, some of the best case scenarios are that a guy like a Zion Johnson or a Trevor Penning or even Tyler Linderbaum, player that a lot of teams kind of view to be a bit too undersized, would fall out of the first round. Then it would have made sense to go offense in round two. Now, a lot of the reason the Bears want Bears fans wanted the team to go offense in round two simply because teams and fans are recognizing that it is a league that's driven by elite offenses and great quarterback play. So naturally, getting that help for Justin Fields would have made sense. But, we saw with round one, I mean, as soon as a guy like Zion Johnson and Linderbaum kind of went in round one, even Cole Strange, who was a major surprise pick, by the way, but a typical New England Patriots pick, you kind of knew that at that point going into Friday, things were going to open up for the Bears. Now, if you want my analysis on the first selection of Kyla Gordon, I'm going to keep it plain and simple here. I'm not surprised the Bears went this route. You mentioned that the Bears have had such a major hole in the secondary, but I also think that we have to understand something is that going into the offseason, there were three legitimate needs that we all had classified for the Bears. It was offensive line, wide receiver, and cornerback. So I'm not mad with the Kyler Gordon pick at all, just because I think that he should still be, he's a first round prospect, make no mistake. But he slipped to round two specifically because there was that weird run on offensive linemen and wide receivers. I mean, the draft is all about layers and dominoes that fall a specific way. The top 10 went about as predictable as it could get, right? The middle half of the first round, I thought, was where things really started to shake up, which kind of set the stage for why the Bears went and drafted the way they did on day two. I mean, look, Jaquan Brisker, I know, is a polarizing pick, specifically because a lot of people are like, why would you even go with safety at 48th overall when, just 3 to 4 picks later, you had George Pickens, Alec Pierce, and Sky Moore go. Now, you could argue two things here. It would have made sense, I think, for the Bears to go any of those wide receivers, but I also think that for Ryan Poles and Matt Eberflus, selecting Brisker was all about getting that tough, talented, physical, versatile safety who can play multiple places in Matt Eberflus's defense. He can play 15 to 20 yards behind the line of scrimmage. He can also go ahead and operate in the box. And I just think that, when Matt Eberflus talks about the speed, the physicality, get your track shoes on because we're going to do a lot of running. I think Jaquan Brisker is a prospect that embodies that. You look at Velus Jones Jr., okay, that was a bit of a odd pick if we're going to be honest. But you also look at it, I mean, in that point in the draft, Velus Jones Jr., Jalen Tolbert, they were, I think, two wide receivers and David Bell too, so there's and Danny Ray, only four wide receivers really selected in round four, which just
Well,
kind of shows that.
I
Oh,
don't
I'm
mean to
sorry,
interrupt you, but let me ask you
oh, go
this with
ahead.
that. You mentioned those guys. Would you say any of those guys are number one wide receivers? I wouldn't. I don't think so. I think David Bell could be a good two. I mean, he could develop into number one, but I don't think I think I understand the Velus Jones argument with that, and I think what you said is true. I don't think there was a good number one wide receiver available in the second round. Maybe Christian Watson and George Pickens. The thing with Pickens though is there was something with the red flag with his not off field stuff, but kind of what's happened to him, in between the, when the whistle blows, when the whistle's done, and the injury as well. So I agree. I mean, I think, Velus Jones Jr., it's a little bit of a reach. I don't know if any of those guys, I mean, David Bell could turn into a number one, but I don't know. I don't think Jalen Tolbert's a number one. I think the Bears' plan is they're going to roll with what they have right now. And another thing, and I'm not saying you specifically here because I don't think you've done this. A lot of people I see are saying, Darnell Mooney's a number one. David Montgomery's an elite back. Cole Kmet's going to be an elite tight end. But then they also say, well, Justin Fields has no weapons. So it's I don't know. If you're going to say one thing, the other thing doesn't, mean true. That's not specifically towards you or anything. I'm just saying, in general, I'm seeing people that are like, well, they don't have any weapons, but Darnell Mooney's a one, but elite, David Montgomery's elite, but, stuff like that. So I do think they need to help Justin Fields with weapons, and I do think they probably should have taken another wide receiver as well. I look at it from the way is I don't know if there was a number one or even number two. Is Jalen Tolbert really ready to come in and be a number two? A guy I look at this, and you mentioned this guy. I want to say on when we recorded on Friday, the kid from Tampa Bay, Jalen Darden.
Yeah, Jalen Darden. That's
Jalen
it.
Darden. A lot of people fell in love with him. A lot of people fell in love with him and thought he'd be a really damn good wide receiver. And that still might be the case, but I feel like a lot of draft Twitter and a lot of fans find their guy and they think he's going to be elite number one, blah, blah. I thought Daz Newsome would be a solid prospect. He's not. I think he's got a long ways to go. I, also thought there would be other prospects the Bears should have targeted that would be elite in the NFL, and they're not. I mean, it's hard. We just have to. The bottom line is we have to trust Ryan Poles, and we have to trust these guys. And to kind of wrap that part up, and I'll let you kind of finish. I'm sorry for interrupting. You know, I'd like to go back and look at the reaction to Darnell Mooney when he was drafted in the 5th round. I'm sure there's people out there saying he was a good prospect, but there's probably people out there that are like, who the heck is this guy? He played at Tulane. Nothing against that, but I mean, they're not playing Ohio State every week in the Big Ten. They're not playing the Pac-12, the SEC, the ACC. They're not playing these schools. They did play Ohio State, but not that level of talent every week. So it's just, we kind of have to just trust Ryan Poles, I'd say.
Yeah, so, getting back to it here, I mean, I have the draft order pulled up in front of me because it's hard to keep track of every single pick, but I counted just 3
It
or
is.
sorry, 4 wide receivers drafted in round 3. You know,
Yeah.
there's something to be said, okay? When you look at the wide receivers that basically went, I believe, 50, 51, 52, right, in round 2, which was, Pickens, Alec Pierce, Sky Moore, and then you have right after that, the 4 that went in round 3. I mean, if we're being honest about something, then and Mechie, Tyquan Thornton went in round 2 as well as Wan'Dale Robinson, okay, and Christian Watson. If we're gonna be specifically honest with ourselves, we have to understand that's like what 6 or 7 wide receivers that went in 2 rounds. The
Yeah.
point is, I think, is that there's 2 lessons we learned from this. Number 1, this was a super top heavy wide receiver class because you saw the crazy run on receivers. You saw that all the guys that were projected and mocked to go in round 1 went in round 1. Okay. But then number 2, I think it really speaks to the point here is that the Bears did not see any of these guys as being players who could significantly develop into ones. And here's why. Because at the NFL level, what you're trying to do is this is you're trying to project what a player did in college versus what a player is going to do at the next level. Okay. And, teams have their different ways of grading prospects. So, like a team such as Green Bay, clearly you could tell by the trade up with Minnesota, had Christian Watson ranked and graded much higher on the big board compared to a team like the Bears, let's say, or the Vikings, who traded out of that very selection.
Yeah.
And so I think, like the whole argument of, okay, Justin Fields doesn't have any weapons. Let's be honest with ourselves here. The Bears don't have an elite core of skill position
Yeah.
players.
They don't.
Darnell Mooney, okay, listen. Let's play devil's advocate with Darnell Mooney here too, because 50% of it is the fact that he did become the quarterback's favorite targets last year. And I say quarterbacks and not Justin Fields because the Bears cycled through 3 quarterbacks last year. But then on the other hand, you could say, hey, the wide receiver core was so weak last year. Marquise Goodwin, Damiere Byrd kind of struggled to stay healthy. Daz
Yeah.
Newsome, a guy that didn't see the field until the Bears traveled to Seattle
Yeah.
late in the 2021 season. So on the other hand, and then Allen Robinson, missed a couple of games, but just was non-existent. There were times I was watching the Bears last year. I remember I'm like, does Allen Robinson even exist at this point? Like, where's number 12? And so the other half of the argument is the fact that is Darnell Mooney legitimately this good? Or is it the fact that Allen Robinson and the Bears had no wide receivers last year to throw to besides Darnell Mooney? And so, when I look at the skill position group overall, I still think that it's a group that has some upside to it. Cole Kmet, I don't think it has hit his ceiling yet. I think Darnell Mooney with more consistent quarterback play, not with, Nick Foles, Mitch Trubisky, Andy Dalton, Justin Fields. And yeah, it's pretty much all the quarterbacks the Bears have had over the last 2 years throwing him the ball. I think with just one consistent presence, Darnell Mooney can be a good 1B. You look at David Montgomery, who behind a shaky offensive line has done really well, but the Bears have not maximized David Montgomery's potential. I think that David Montgomery's a guy that can have 2,000 yards from scrimmage a season. So ultimately, the point I'm making is that the Bears have some talent, but it's not talent that blows you away by any means. And so people's argument of, well, the Bears do need more skill position players, I think it is 110% justified. Now, I will say, though, looking at this draft class, It is disappointing, though, that Ryan Poles only opted to take one wide receiver, because I look at a team like the Chiefs, for example. I mean, the Chiefs had Tyreek Hill and Travis Kelce, but what did they do in 2018 or 19? They made McCall Hardman a second round pick. And so the good teams in this league identify when they have a weakness and when they have the additional flexibility with draft picks, like the Bears had on day 3 and traded out of the slot that the Bills used to select Khalil Shakir. The good teams consistently add to the best positional groups no matter what, because it's better to have 3, 4, 5, 2 or 3 really good players, 2 or 3 really solid players to just for a positional group, because it just creates a well-rounded positional group as well. And on top of that, it helps with depth.
And we don't know what Ryan Poles' plan is for wide receiver. We don't know, because the wide receiver position right now, let's be real, it's changing in the NFL. It is. You're getting guys that are going to year 3 and 4. They want to be paid a lot of money. And that's why a lot of them are being traded, right now. And it is easier to find replacements in the draft, which, I agree. I think on day 3, the Bears probably should have spent another pick on a wide receiver. I would have liked that, especially with the guys who were there. But we just don't know, who was on Ryan Poles' board. Did he trust, someone like Alec Pierce? Did he trust someone like Sky Moore or, even David Bell, Khalil Shakir, guys like Romeo Dobbs, guys like that? I mean, we don't know. We don't know the background, any of that stuff. I don't think we will know. The other thing is, he told us they're going to build in the trenches. They're going to build this team up from the trenches, and they're going to make sure that's right. And looking at free agency, they tried to do that with Larry Ogunjobi. It didn't work out. They went and got Justin Jones on the defensive line. They also went out on the offensive line, got Lucas Patrick, who's going to be a starter. I think they have one hole on their offensive line to fill. I'm not saying Tevin Jenkins and Larry Bourne are a solution at tackle. I think you could roll with them in week 1, or you could roll with moving Tevin Jenkins to the inside. You already have Cody White here at one of the guard spots. Lucas Patrick's going to be your center, unless that you want to move him to guard, and maybe Doug Kramer can start at center. I think they have one piece to kind of figure out. I don't think Dakota Dozier or Sam Mustipher is the answer, but they have 4 guys they drafted on day 3 that they're going to come in and compete. They spent their first pick on day 3 after trading back on Braxton Jones, a really raw, athletic type of prospect at offensive tackle. He's a big guy. He needs some work, though. And then they went out and got Zachary Thomas, who might be just a tad bit more polished. He played, out there at San Diego State, so a little tougher competition. They went Doug Kramer at Illinois, a true center, probably could play a little guard as well. And they went with Jatari Carter. I'm sorry, I'm butchering this name. The prospect out of Southern, who is also a raw talent and a guy that, could come in and compete as well. So I think we're going to be in a spot where they try to plug in the offensive line. They're not married to Tevin Jenkins. They're not married to Larry Borum. And they're hoping that one of these 4 offensive linemen pan out. And they also addressed holes in their secondary as well. And I think that's a good plan. I think just the wide receiver position got so much attention throughout the offseason, the help with Justin Fields. And I say this, look, if Justin Fields is elite, he's going to be elite. He's going to be elite. It'll be fine. If he's not elite this year, I understand. And I think he's a player that's going to take that next step. Yeah, getting him some help probably is a good idea. But there's also a scenario where he could showcase his skills and be, an elite quarterback without these weapons. And then you build from there. I think fans got to realize this year is just going to be a complete wash. I mean, they're going to be bad this year. The only thing holding them back from not being probably the worst team or one of the worst teams is their schedule's pretty easy. That's okay. They need a top 5 pick. Next year's class is going to be loaded at wide receiver. Next year's class is going to be loaded at edge talent. Next year's class is going to have some really good playmakers there in the top 10, which the Bears should be picking in. We just got to have to accept it is a rebuild. It's something that, we have to go through because of the previous regime. But with the day 3, I kind of want to talk about this, and I noticed a common theme here with all these picks, maybe outside the punter. You look at the 4 offensive linemen, you look at defensive end Dominique Robinson, you look at running back Treston Ebner, you look at safety Elijah Hicks. These guys are all very, very athletic. They are very athletic players, and I think we found what Ryan Poles' type is. He wants athletic players that offer some versatility. You look at some of these offensive line, it might be interchangeable. You look at Elijah Hicks, who's a safety but also has special teams value. Treston Ebner, I'm really excited about because I think a lot of people see, oh, it's a running back here. They already have two running backs. He's more of a pass catching running back with a lot of good special teams upside. I mean, I believe he was the back to back Big 12 special teams player of the year at one point in his career. He's a guy that they're going to use as a change of pace back on third down. That's going to help, take some of the pressure off Montgomery and Herbert and kind of add another dimension to the offense. And I honestly wouldn't be shocked if we saw him used, in the slot as well, lining up as a wide receiver, as a weapon. I think that's the plan for him. And Elijah Hicks, I mentioned the special teams versatility there as well, but very, very athletic guys, as you could see by their RAS scores as well.
Yeah, so there's two things I want to mention. I mean, we saw the Bears take four offensive linemen on day three, and I think that that really speaks to Ryan Poles' roots in Kansas City. Not because he is a former offensive lineman, but when you go back and you look at the Chiefs' draft history, I mean, Andy Reid got there in 2013. I believe since from 2013 to 2021, the Chiefs basically selected like 10 offensive linemen in that time span. And you're not looking at guys that were drafted high. I mean, you're looking at just all over the board in terms of, Eric Fisher, Eric Kush, Zach Fulton, Lauren Duvernay, Tardif, Mitch Morse, even. So really guys that were almost selected in every single round. But, when you shift the conversation over to just the fact that Ryan Poles is looking for athletes, I liken the current state of the NFL to the NBA here in a sense, just in the sense that if you remember when the Warriors basically went on their major run with Steve Kerr in the late 2010s, I mean, it was very clear that small ball had taken over the NFL. And I think, I'm sorry, the NBA, and, where those players were playing basically everywhere. Steph Curry, Draymond Green, there was a certain versatility associated with it. I think we're seeing the exact same thing in the NFL now. And, the versatility component is just so key for this offense that Luke Getzey is going to run. Because if he does run an offense that's very similar to what Kyle Shanahan's doing in San Francisco and Matt LaFleur's doing up in Green Bay, you're going to see a lot of these players moved around. Like, that's why the Bears went ahead and selected Velus Jones Jr. And I'm not going to say that Velus Jones Jr. has Debo Samuel like traits. That's someone else's words. Daniel Jeremiah of NFL.com. Those are not my words, but you're seeing that that experience he has is very similar to a Debo Samuel and his ability to line up in the backfield, basically play whatever. I know that some people are going to say, oh, well, this is the exact same thing Matt Nagy tried to do in terms of moving a guy like a Cordero Patterson all over the place from the slot to the backfield. I think there's a difference, though. The fact that these are players who hopefully fit the Bears scheme that Ryan Poles is acquiring versus Matt Nagy, who was just like, hey, let's just throw some mud at the wall, see what sticks. And by the way, I should say regarding Treston Ebner, the running back that the Bears selected on day three, when I did additional research about him, it's interesting because I found out that he actually does have a bit of a background playing as a wide receiver. I think I saw that he was a all-state prep receiver back in high school too. So, the point is this is that for the Bears, when it comes to these 11 picks, I just thought that, athletes is being one thing, but also just the versatility that exists, and the versatility is all over the place. It's that a player like Kyla Gordon can play both inside and outside the numbers. Jaquan Brisker can play, as I mentioned earlier, up in the box for 15 to 20 behind the line of scrimmage. You have a guy like Velus Jones who's moved all over the place. The offensive lineman they drafted, you know what? A player like a Braxton Jones, sure, he played offensive tackle in college, but because he went to a relatively smaller school, then his best fit might just be inside at guard because a lot of this is what happens. A lot of players at the NFL level, especially the offensive linemen, if they are not able to go ahead and handle playing tackle because their arm length is too short, those guys kick inside the guard and do make pretty good guards too. And then ultimately you look at a guy like a Elijah Hicks, who they selected on day three. He's just a very hard hitting safety that was basically ball production was his defining trait while he was with the California Golden Bears. Ebner again is another one who basically played receiver, quarterback, linebacker, and defensive back. So I'm not saying, and that's in high school. So I'm not saying that, all 11 of these players are going to be hidden gems and starters by any means. But I said this on Twitter today that if the Bears can get, 6 or 7 of these players to turn into quality starters or just solid depth pieces that the team does keep bringing back on these cheap 1 to 2 year deals, I think you're going to see this be a successful draft class by far.
Well, and now the other thing is as we kind of wrap this up with the draft here, they drafted athletes, they drafted players that they think they're going to come in and compete. Obviously, that's the goal. Now the coaches have to do their part. They have to develop these players, have to put them in the right situation. I think Matt Eberflus understands that. We're going to get our first look this weekend at rookie minicamp, and we're going to kind of see. It's not going to tell us a lot. They're not practicing with the full team. They'll happen again later on in May when most of the team is there. But now it's time to develop these guys. Can you turn, you did the drafting part, but can you turn these players into legit starters? The best way to accelerate a rebuild and become a contender in 2023 is hitting on these draft picks. I think they came away with 2 legit starters on defense on day 2. If they could come away with 1 legit offensive lineman starter and then a nice role player at running back with Ebner, and maybe a nice value on special teams with Hicks late, and then maybe who knows about the punter as well, I would consider that a very successful draft. If you can get a couple pieces, they don't have to be stars. I'm not saying they have to be perennial Pro Bowlers. That's very hard to do. It's very hard to do with first-round picks. It's just get some of these guys, develop them, legit starters, and that's how you accelerate a rebuild. And, if Ryan Poles and this coaching staff can do that, it's going to be very interesting. I guess the other thing we should kind of mention is Nick Foles is no longer on the roster. That was kind of some news that happened on Saturday night after the draft. And, the Bears were shopping him. He was a guy that they tried shopping literally through the draft. They were trying to pull off a trade. Here's the problem, though. No one was going to pay that contract. If they got any money for that. No one was going to give them a draft pick. And the Bears did not want to give up any of their draft picks, because no one would do that except for Ryan Pace. So it's like about time to end it. I'm kind of happy how Ryan Poles did it. He let them go. They're going to eat the money here. It's unfortunate, but it kind of ties into this is a rebuild. We're seeing bad contracts finally get off the books. Finally, the Bears can kind of start to free themselves with some money here. They can kind of rebuild their team. They don't have to worry about having, Nick Foles on the roster and what the problem is there and what's he going to do. So it's a process. We're starting to accelerate the process a little bit here. And I'm sure more moves are coming. Free agency, there's a lot of players out in free agency. I mean, I don't think people understand, Tyrone Matthews still out there. Jarvis Landry's out there. The Bears had Akeem Hicks and Eddie Goldman still aren't signed. I'm not saying they're coming back or anything, but there's a lot of players out there. There's going to be more players at cuts. There's going to be more players this summer. There's time to kind of accelerate this a little bit and get it going. I guess I've said it before, but to wrap it up, you say, why don't you give me who your favorite draft pick was and why?
Yeah, so, there's 2 things here, and I think number 1 to add on to your comment before I answer your question is just the fact that the Bears went from being this offseason in a span of just 3 to 4 months. They went from being one of the oldest teams to one of the youngest teams in the NFL, especially with the 11 draft picks, and then we're not even counting the undrafted free agents yet. That's one thing, but then also number 2, the next 3 big contracts, like Ryan Poles has made it his mission this offseason to offload a lot of these contracts. It started with Khalil Mack. Akeem Hicks, Eddie Goldman were not coming back. Danny Trevathan's going to be a post-June 1st cut. And then on the offensive side of the ball, you're going to have Cody Whitehair, who's probably in his last season with the Bears in 2022. Robert Quinn's days are obviously numbered. Eddie Jackson's one of those where I could certainly see the Bears keeping him around to finish out his contract in 2024, or I could see the Bears moving on after 2023 and making him a post-June 1st cut, because the last time I looked at the financials, I mean, it just makes more sense for the Bears to cut Eddie Jackson, I think save 13 to 14 million in cap space post-June 1st, 2023, than it does to keep him around and just make him like a pre-June 1st cut. But I think, my favorite pick overall of this draft, and I'm not going to go with any of the top guys in Gordon or Brisker, but I am so intrigued to see how a player like Treston Ebner is going to fit into the Bears offense. Because let's be honest about something. I mean, Damian Williams is not back. He's with the Atlanta Falcons, and the Bears do have 2 pretty good running backs in Khalil Herbert as well as David Montgomery. And I don't think that the selection of Ebner per se should play into the Bears kind of moving on from David Montgomery because he is going into a contract here. But I think, it's going to be interesting to see what the Bears do with a guy like Treston Ebner, specifically because we know the versatility that he has. He's a pure running back. He's also a really good receiver, both in the slot and out of the backfield. So, what are the Bears going to do this upcoming season when it comes to, game planning and drawing up plays for these guys like Ebner, Velus Jones, Darnell Mooney, Byron Pringle? I think that one of the most intriguing things to see is going to be when Ebner and Velus Jones are on the field, just what types of play designs and formations the Bears roll out. Because I think you're going to see a lot of, you know, 12, but also 21 personnel at times.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting. I'm going to go with one of the top guys. I love Kyla Gordon. I think that's a fantastic pick. I think he's a first round talent. Slipped a little bit for whatever reason. I mocked him in the first round late. I think it's going to be something like a Jalen Johnson situation where the Bears got a first round talent in the second round. He's going to be an impact player right away. And if Jalen Johnson and Kyler Gordon are your two corners for 5 to 8 years from now, I mean, that's fantastic. You're set there. I think the Bears did a good job there. I think, he's a good cover corner, got some good speed on him, doesn't have a ton of takeaways, but also, does get his hands on the football for batted passes, things like that. And he's a good tackler, too. He's not afraid to come up in the run game and provide some support. And I like him. I really like Brisker as well. So, yeah, I'm excited. I'm excited to see these guys on the field. I think, this class is going to be very important. And, maybe we'll look back one day and say, man, the Bears got 2 legit starters on defense, maybe a couple starters on offense. Who knows? But I'm excited. So kind of wrap things up. You say, where can everyone follow you at on Twitter and read your work at?
Yeah, guys, you can follow me on Twitter at Usaid Culturals. Check out my work on the Bear Report as well. A lot of the storyline articles are going to be coming back because there's actually something going on at Hallis Hall that is not the NFL draft anymore. We'll have coverage for you next week coming from Hallis Hall because of rookie minicamp as well. So stay tuned for all that and check out the Picks for Polls podcast too, where we'll be having guests on just to break down each of the Bears draft prospects. And the guests are going to be beat writers from the specific colleges.
Yes, and look for that. We got a couple lined up. And then please follow the Bear Report on Twitter at Just Bear Report. And please rate, review, and subscribe on all major podcasting platforms. It really helps this podcast and the Picks for Polls podcast. Until next time, everyone, please stay safe.